So welcome everyone to the event, Students at High Risk of COVID Complications, Know Your Rights. My name is Alyssa Chen. I'm located in Burlington and I work for the Education Justice Coalition of Vermont, and I'm excited to be here with Cammie Naylor, who's going to do a bit of Q&A later today with us. I just wanted to take a minute to just honor the legacy of Deborah Lacey Baker. For those of you that don't know Deborah, she was a disability rights activist who was very involved in the Education Justice Coalition and passed away pretty suddenly back in March. And one of the last events she did with the coalition was actually an event about masks and the importance of it and trying to support students with disabilities. And so I just want to name her and bring her into this space and honor her legacy with this work. So the objectives for this evening is to dispel the myth that we can't have masking in the classroom, is to let advocates and families for high-risk students know what their rights are, let advocates and families of high-risk students know how to pursue their rights and what to do if their rights are violated, and let advocates and families of high-risk students know how to prepare for IEP and 504 meetings. And hopefully coming here together is the idea to give advocates and families hope so that they can take action and move forward. And unfortunately, these are some objectives that we won't be able to cover in depth, but we certainly encourage other folks to put together events, or we're welcome to collaborate on future events and share resources. And specifically, that's how to support family members that are at high risk of COVID and have kids in schools. And we're not going to fully cover how to advocate at the school level for COVID mitigations. Although, and let me know if I pronounce your name. How do you pronounce your name? Yves?
Eve.
Eve, okay, thanks, Eve. So although Eve gave us a great letter that I've included in the resources that kind of gets at that second bullet. So the agenda for this evening, this is our intro section. I'm going to do a quick slide, just kind of what we know about COVID, naming the ways that the disease that we know has shifted slightly throughout time. The middle of the presentation will be a Q&A with Cammie. We have some prepared questions, and then we'll have some time for open Q&A. Cammie will do her best to try to answer questions, and we can also get back to folks. We have folks' emails. So if there's something that we can't answer tonight, we're happy to get those back to you. I'm going to share some tips from a parent that were shared with me anonymously from a parent who has done some advocacy work around this for their kid. And then we'll go over a fact sheet, which is a resource that we welcome you to use and share and give any feedback on, and we'll just give an overview of that and talk a bit about next steps. Any questions or anything anyone needs as we get started here? Yeah, feel free to use the chat if you want to encourage people or ask questions. The chat's open for you to use and engage with. And appreciate folks coming out tonight. So just some things to name about the current iteration of COVID is that it's much more contagious than the initial version. Things that we knew about the initial version around people weren't getting infected outside. They told us you had to be around someone for 15 minutes. These things have shifted. It is possible to get it outside. You can get in just a passing exposure. We now know that previous infection and vaccination doesn't mean that people are safe. In fact, they can get reinfected in as little as 3 weeks. We know that each additional infection brings a higher level of risk for long-term negative impacts, which may be cumulative. You know that one-way masking does not prevent infection, and we just want to reiterate that although hand washing is a nice gesture, this is an airborne disease, and therefore masking is really the main protection. So I'm going to pull up some questions here, take us off of screen share, and see if I can, let's see, spotlight for everyone, see if that works. Spotlight Cammie.
Just spotlighted me.
Yeah, hopefully that's okay.
Yeah, that's
Cammie, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself, and then we'll do some questions.
absolutely. Hello, good evening. My name's Cammie Naylor. I am a staff attorney with the Disability Law Project at Vermont Legal Aid. So the project within Legal Aid that I work with, we exclusively represent people whose legal issues arise out of their disability. About a third of the work that we do is representing and assisting families in special education matters related to their children with disabilities. So, we have been monitoring and involved assisting families in this type of COVID advocacy really since the pandemic began. There's been lots of special education needs that have in a lot of ways just been dropped. And so, yeah, that's me. Anything
Cool.
else, Alyssa?
That's it. Yeah. So I'm going to put the question in the chat and also read them out for folks. So the What are the rights for students that are at high risk of COVID complications? If you want to speak to that question to get us started.
Yeah, absolutely. So the rights for students who are at high risk for COVID complications, first I want to start with where do they come from? So a student who's qualified under the IDEA, so receiving special education related services, is entitled to a free and appropriate public education. A student who is a student with a disability and is on a 504 plan, so they have a medical or mental or physical impairment that substantially limits a major life activity, and that's impacting their access to education. Typically, we see those students on 504 plans if they don't qualify for special education related services. And then also some of these rights can come through from the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, under Title II. And that would really kind of getting at that would really be about how you were presenting arguments. But in this case, most of the cases that we're talking about for kiddos or who are identified as being a student with a disability already, and or also a student who is at high risk for COVID and can show disability that brings them to that high risk, they're going to be entitled to a free and appropriate public education through the IDEA or Section 504. What free and appropriate public education means in both of those circumstances is a little bit different, but really different from like an educational perspective, not as much from an access perspective. So so students should be entitled to accommodations or modifications that ensure that they can access their free and appropriate public education. Those can look like masking. It can look like certain distancing, windows. Oh, I mean, I know that some of the medical facts show that there's transmission outdoors, but it can be greater ventilation. Whatever those accommodations are, there has to be a nexus between, or the requested accommodation, there has to be a nexus between the child's disability and the accommodation that you're asking for. So, one of the examples that I've been talking about recently with our project is there's a lot of really strong evidence that suggests and supports that people who have Down syndrome are, more likely to contract COVID. If they do contract COVID, they're more likely to have really significant outcomes. And so showing nexus there is likely going to be more straightforward. Some of the medical research that's coming out now supports that initially, folks with asthma were at incredibly high risk. The medical evidence, as we're seeing higher vaccination rates, is changing on what that risk looks like. And so you are entitled to accommodations and modifications. Those accommodations and modifications must have a nexus or a direct link between the disability and the accommodation requested. And then you need evidence to support that. So in a lot of cases, in a lot of the kinds of cases that we're talking about tonight, for students who are at high risk for COVID, that's going to be medical evidence. And the medical evidence, based on what we're seeing, needs to be very strong, specific, tied to research. And I've heard from a few physicians that they are really having to play a very instructive role with the IEP team and the 504 team. There's just a lot of misinformation or like a lack of information. And so thinking about what is it my child needs to stay safe, how is that going to be achieved? And then sort of the third difficulty or prong is that districts are going to have the ability to defend against or say, we are not going to provide this accommodation or modification for two reasons. The first would be fundamental alteration, and the second would be undue burden. And so to undue burden, there's been a lot of funding to schools. And so if the question is, we can't afford the cost of masks to provide to the students in schools. That is going to be a question of an undue burden that is less compelling. There's a lot of funding. You can likely afford some masks. And the question of fundamental alteration is challenging. And the reason that it's challenging is because we know a lot of what learning is nonverbal. And we know that masking can impact how someone receives nonverbals in their environment. So that's a piece of the fundamental alteration argument that's happening. And so one of the ways to overcome the fundamental alteration argument is to be making sure that requests that are being made, if the request is for masking, is really tailored and specific. So thinking about asking a classroom or cohort to be masking versus masking school-wide. Or, does it need to happen in the classroom and in the hallways? And what do those situations look like? And really working to be making a very exacting request is one of the things right now that we're seeing that's going to make those requests more compelling and harder for a district to say, well, that's just a fundamental alteration of the educational environment. And someone could come back and say, well, we've had masking in schools for the last year and a half, 2 years. Like there's no way this is a fundamental alteration. And I think that that's very legitimate. And, we are seeing a push to move away from thinking of COVID-19 as a pandemic towards thinking of COVID as an endemic. And so what I think a lot of families are going to begin to experience or see is schools saying, well, before COVID, when it was the flu, you weren't asking for masking, and the flu can be airborne too. So why weren't you asking? And maybe the flu's I'm not a medical provider. I don't know that, but overcoming that question and also overcoming the question of why isn't it sufficient? Why is one-way masking not sufficient to protect your child? And so having medical support that's really strong that can speak to those questions is going to set families up. So the question was, what are the rates of students at high risk for COVID complications? Most of them are entitled to a free and appropriate public education. Otherwise, they're entitled to accommodations and modifications that allow them to access the educational environment. And that access has to be equitable to their same-aged peers. And so what is it that's going to make the school safer for a child to be able to be there? And then I'm going to minimize that question just for now. I did see it pop up. So that's what the right is. But as you can see from my explanation, it can be a lot more detailed and involved. So I think it makes sense for me to talk a little bit. Alyssa, if it makes sense a little bit, I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of what the process can look like and what we might recommend or encourage families to do.
Yeah, that sounds great. And if folks want to put questions in the chat, we'll definitely come back to those.
Yeah, absolutely.
The
So
question.
as far as like, what can that process look like? Number one on my list or my recommendation to any family what does your physician say? What does your child's physician say? Can they support your request? If the answer is we don't know, they're kind of ambivalent, then working with, if your child has specialists, working with those specialists who perhaps are not as ambivalent, or really working to inform and instruct your child's physician, because that medical evidence is really, the quality of the medical evidence you have is going to be what carries the day. So you have a child who's at high risk for COVID. Now, there are going to be some kids who are in classifications that have high risk for COVID who, whether they have an IEP or a 504 plan, is, they might not. So I'm thinking of, a kid who has asthma, who the way that they handle their asthma is carrying an inhaler around at school. And then maybe they have another underlying condition that does put them at high risk, that with the asthma puts them at a different risk level for COVID. And so that family is going to be wanting to think about starting the 504 process, saying we need a 504 plan, the accommodation we need is this, and beginning that conversation. Ultimately, that child might be receiving that access through Title II and perhaps not 504. I think in that particular context, it really could go either way. But by and large, I'm making the assumption here that a family has a student who's already on a 504 plan or an IEP. So you've checked in with your doctor agrees, and they're writing or have written a letter of support. That letter of support, states your child's medical condition, explains that they're at high risk for COVID, and is a little bit tailored to why or how COVID might have an additional impact on them, what that high risk could potentially look like for them, and then is making a medical recommendation. And that medical recommendation, again, is tailored to you to be the least burdensome on the district, which is really frustrating for families, but that is one of those things that's going to make their defensive arguments harder to make. So again, we're asking for masking in the classroom and lunch with social distancing in a very ventilated space, whatever that request is. We're asking for masking specifically in my child's classroom, but that everyone masks in the hallways, or that certain classes mask in the hallways at certain times when my child's in the hall. These aren't necessarily simple requests, and I think Alyssa alluded to earlier that the request for school-wide masking is that one's, I think, in a lot of cases, in a court type situation, whomever is the decider will find in favor of the district if we're not thinking about more specifically how we're protecting our individual child and their access rights. So checking in with the doctor, letter of support, request a meeting in writing. Always make those meeting requests in writing. If you have a child who's on an IEP and you make a request for a meeting, you are entitled to a meeting within 30 days. If the district is going to deny the meeting, they can do one of two things: hold the meeting, have a conversation with you, and then deny it. They also have the ability to send you prior written notice of a denial. And so that would form the basis for some type of appeal or action against them. If you have a child who's on a 504 plan, you don't have the same benefit of a timeline for when to hold the meeting. And so the burden in a lot of cases falls to families to continue asking or encouraging the district to hold a meeting. My recommendation in both situations would be to say, we would like to have a meeting to talk about COVID precautions and mitigations in schools as an accommodation to my child, and we'd like to that meeting scheduled as quickly as possible. If you have a kiddo who's on a 504 plan and maybe 2 weeks have gone by and you haven't heard anything from the district, I would make that request again. And then if they continue to fail to respond to your request, then you might have the basis for a complaint. In all of these cases, families really don't have a basis for a complaint until there's been some sort of action by the school that says no. So failing to hold the meeting, failing to respond to the request or scheduling a meeting, actually saying we're not going to accommodate this way, denying the accommodation, typically is part of a conversation around what accommodations are needed. And especially in an IEP and 504 process, the intention is for there to be some dialogue to figure out what is the accommodation or modification that's going to best serve the need, and be the least burdensome to carry out on the public entity, right, the school. So there should be some dialogue. Some of that dialogue could look like the school saying, well, we don't really think that we can manage this, but we might be able to manage X, Y, and Z, or, whatever that looks like. I can't think of what that might be at this moment. We really can't mandate masking in the entire classroom. We can strongly encourage all students to mask. We can ask the teacher to remind students to mask. And I think one thing that's important as part of the conversation about masking is that as much as masking is an accommodation for one child, there are other children for which not masking is likewise an accommodation for them. And so that other child, if they are in a classroom where there is a need to mask, the school would be thinking about, okay, so how can we make sure that these kiddos are distanced? What services are we providing the child who's having difficulty masking for disability related reasons, so that they are practicing masking and encouraged to do so? What does that look like? So there's always competing factors. And so that's why having your medical evidence up front is going to be really important. And in many cases, IEP and 504 teams are, in some cases, they're going to be convinced by a doctor's letter and a conversation with the parent. I've been hearing of more and more cases where it's necessary for a physician to attend, to be the person who's answering the team's questions. So that was a lot. Alyssa, is there any part of that question you think I haven't answered yet?
No, I think that was great. I wonder if we can do these 2 questions in the chat because they feel like interesting questions, and then
Okay.
I'll throw a couple more that I've planned for you.
Yeah.
I'm going to read them out just for the video too. So the first one, can a superintendent or principal require a class to mask if there is an outbreak of 10% or more in the class?
I don't see why not. Unless there's a child in that classroom who, for some reason, needs an accommodation against masking, I think we can expect that superintendents and principals can always require more than less. And I'm fairly certain that something like this is consistent with the CDC guidance that encourages districts and schools to think about COVID in levels and transmission levels. And if community transmission is rising, to implement additional COVID protections and mitigation strategies. That's the CDC's current recommendations to schools, which is different than what we've seen so far in Vermont. And so I would say that a practice or a procedure like this, enacting a policy like this, is consistent with the CDC's current guidance.
Well, thanks so much. And then this other question is one we actually talked about, and I'll pop the fact sheet in because we answer it there, but it'd be great for you to answer it too.
Sure.
What if the at-risk person is an adult in the home, not the student? What legal protections, if any, are there?
So a family member or a person in the home is not entitled to the same type of accommodations that the child who's attending school is. We're not going to be seeing, I don't expect we'll be seeing situations where a child is accommodated in order to accommodate a family member. And so what we do know is that if that family member needs to attend the school for some reason or attend a school function or meeting, there should be accommodations. Those are individual accommodations for that person under Title II of the ADA. So that person should be receiving those accommodations. But I think making the argument that you need to have masking in the classroom because I am the at-risk person, I, the parent, and I'm making assumptions here for the sake of trying to communicate clearly, but say a parent is at risk for COVID-19. And they would like their child to be in a classroom where there is masking to protect them. That's going to be a really hard argument to make because the particular child who's in the classroom is not the person who's entitled to accommodations or modifications. So that's a Title II conversation. The parent would be saying to the school district, the public entity, so Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act covers public entities and the government. And so the parent would be saying, you know, I need people in my children's classroom to mask because I'm at risk. That's going to be a really difficult argument to make. So unless you have some incredibly compelling medical evidence and the support of a really compelling medical provider, I think it's going to be very difficult because the individual child is not entitled to those accommodations. We're really asking that a burden be put on all children in the classroom for essentially a third party. So I think that's a really difficult one to make. It's not one that I've seen.
Cool, thanks so much. We're gonna take this one more question, and then we'll go to a couple that we had. So I'll read this out for the video. Given that we are talking about an airborne illness, are there any discussions being had around state-right advocacy about Vermont creating a standalone virtual program that is equivalent quality and that includes inclusive social interactions with peers?
Nothing I've heard of. I've not heard anything from the AOE about trying to stand up a program like this. One of the things that I would say on the virtual piece of it, because I know a lot of families are, well, if you're not going to mask in the classroom, then I really want my child attending virtual. That comes down to a question of a different right under free and appropriate public education, and that one is that a child is expected to receive their free and appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. The least restrictive environment is defined as the environment that's that maximizes the child's interactions and education with their same age non-disabled peers. So something like a standalone virtual program that families who have children at high risk are choosing to enroll them in, that's likely going to be really hard to show that that meets the least restrictive environment. There is some limited case law to support that in certain circumstances, children should have video access into their own gen ed classroom. But that's typically for students who've been determined as homebound, and determining whether a child is receiving their education because they're hospitalized or homebound is a decision that is to the discretion of the IEP team. The medical evidence in those conversations is not, it must be considered, but it's not controlling. And so that's one of the ones where we get at seeing, one of the areas of law where we get at seeing that districts are not obligated to accommodate an individual student for the needs of a sibling or parent, or someone else in the home. And also that's one where we get at that question of, is this the least restrictive environment? Are we maximizing that student's contact with their same age non-disabled peers? And so I think a standalone equivalent program, perhaps if families were opting into it, could meet that requirement. But I think it'd be pretty difficult. Not to say that it's impossible, but I think we'd see a lot of IEP teams saying, I don't think this meets least restrictive environment.
Cool, thanks so much, Cammie. There's another question, we'll wait on that one. I'm gonna do these two kind of go together, and then we'll jump back to questions in the chat. We'll also open it up if people wanna unmic and say hi and ask questions. So Definitely. If you could talk a little bit about, I know some families that have been requesting accommodations and IEPs and 504s have been running into challenges with it. Mm-hmm. Things aren't getting approved. Maybe the school doesn't have all the information and says, sorry, like we can't mask. The governor said we can't mask. So if you could talk a little bit about how do you file a complaint if you have an IEP, and how do you file a complaint if you have a 504, if you feel like your needs are not being met?
Yeah, there's a couple places where students who are on an IEP can think about, or their families can think about, filing a complaint on their behalf. There's a due process complaint, which sets up a hearing process within the state. There's an admin complaint, so that's the state complaint process. Administrative complaints are so specifically for FAPE related issues. And then there's complaints to the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights. And so they're an entity that can look at both just medical discrimination and education type issues. And so I think in general, in a lot of these cases, depending on every case is going to have individual facts and circumstances. But I think in general, OCR is what I've heard is that OCR is extremely open to these complaints. They are using these complaints and trying to then provide more information to districts and states about how we're going to accommodate children. Thanks for the jargon busting. And so I think in a lot of cases, if a family has reached some sort of barrier, they're getting the runaround from the school has specifically told them no, the school's just responded with misinformation, I would generally be recommending an OCR complaint in these circumstances. Some folks have recently had the experience of OCR being relatively fast. OCR has a long history of being rather slow in picking up cases. I think right now they're prioritizing COVID-related educational access cases, but that is something that folks should be aware of. And then, you can always access the state complaint processes. So that's the administrative complaint or a due process complaint. But the administrative and the due process complaint are open to students who are qualified under the IDEA, not just 504. If you're making a FAPE-related argument for a student who has a 504 plan, you can consider filing an administrative complaint. But in any of these cases, until there's been some sort of adverse action against the family. So again, failing to respond to emails after a couple check-ins, not scheduling the meeting within 30 days if your child's on an IEP, flat out saying no, giving you a notice that says no. You've had a couple meetings and the school is being timely and they're engaging in the conversation, but they're not making any decisions. All of these are examples of what could be an adverse action. Until you've had something like that, your complaint's not rape. You don't actually have a legal issue yet because you haven't yet received a no. And so there's obviously some advocacy strategies. We have some incredible tips from a parent coming up in a little bit. So that's where you go to file a complaint.
Cool, thanks so much. And I put the fact sheet in the chat here, and that kind of outlines some of the stuff that Cammie's saying, gives you links to things if you need to do this. And Tim, if you're open to unmiking to share this question, just because you refer to LICE policies and some folks may not know exactly what those are. So if you're open to unmiking and explaining your question, and then Cammie can take that, and then we'll invite other people to unmic and share questions if they'd like to. And Tim might not be on right now. So does anyone else want to unmic and share a question, or we'll read this one from the chat otherwise? Any questions or clarifications for Cammie while we have her on?
I know we had a question on the Jamboard. Sorry, did somebody start? We sort of had a question on the Jamboard, what can you ask for? What can you require of the school? I think that's a really good question, because what you can ask for has to do with how creative are you and your child's medical team able to be? What is it that your child needs to be safe at school? So what you're asking for is whatever it is that has a nexus, that direct link to protecting your child based on their disability. And again, what can we require of the schools? Districts are required to provide access and to accommodate children. And so that's what you can push. You can push the accommodation, and if no accommodation is being offered, again, if the conversation's going nowhere, that's when you can resort to filing a complaint. OCR, the Office of Civil Rights, is fairly pro se litigant or family filing friendly. So that is good news. And the Agency of Education, they've put out some different things, but in general, I find their staff, if you're calling to ask a question about filing a complaint, their staff is as friendly and helpful as I think that they can be under some circumstances. Their staff is really fantastic too.
Well, thanks so much. So we'll read this question. And I don't know what the lice policies are. Maybe you do, but are there any districts in Vermont that have a COVID policy similar, for example, to lice policies that most districts have? Not sure if that. Oh, here we
Okay,
go.
I think Tim popped some follow-up information.
it.
I'll just read it.
Awesome.
So he says, sorry, but most schools have lice policies that have specific processes for handling kids who may have lice. I'm wondering if any other districts have written COVID-specific protocols. None that I'm aware of. In the circumstances that I am aware of, it's been, districts or principals making decisions for individual schools, and those decisions for individual schools are pretty specific as well. Again, like a particular cohort masking everyone, masking in the hallways, staff wearing masks if they're working with anyone in their own workspace. If they're alone in their workspace, that they can remove their masks. And so again, really, really specifically narrowed down to what is it exactly that's needed to prevent transmission. But to my knowledge, I don't know of any districts that have COVID specific protocols. That doesn't mean that there's not. There's lots of school districts in Vermont.
Yeah, and other folks should feel free to chime in too, either in the chat or on mic, because there may be people here that are working in schools that have more information than we do. And that's great to hear. We'd love to hear from any other folks. Any other questions that folks have for Cammie while we have her on? You can unmic or put it in the chat.
Will there be, I don't know if Cammie will do this or if maybe Alyssa, you could do it later. Like, I know that the Office for Civil Rights website is a little hard to navigate. Is it possible to get a look at just like the process for how to file a complaint?
Yeah, I
I
can do
think
that during my
Alyssa has
time.
that in the PowerPoint in a little bit. We have a question from Mel Hauser. Hi, Mel. Have you seen requests for notifications regarding close contacts, which otherwise would not happen? That's not a request I have seen. Doesn't mean it's not a request that shouldn't be tried. I think one of the difficulties of that may be that, again, we're we've moved out of, we're no longer in a state of emergency in Vermont. And so some people are going to make the liberty argument. And so, I don't have to share my own medical information. So if I'm absent, you can assume whatever you want, but I don't have to tell you. One of the things that I often think about that becomes really challenging, especially around the masking, is that in many cases, accommodations for students in schools in typical sort of ordinary times, they often don't require anything of other students. And so I think that's one of the things that's becomes really contentious when we're thinking about asking for masking, is because masking does. And when we usually think about people's rights, like my right to free speech extends to the tip of someone else's nose, right? I'm not to sort of cross into, with certain exceptions, right? I'm not crossing into their bodily space while I'm exercising my rights. And so I think that can be one of the difficulties in thinking about masking, because it does require something of other students. And so pre-pandemic, we would frequently got requests for families who wanted accommodations for their child to be assigned a specific buddy in the classroom, or for their child's best friend to be the person who who they get to sit next to, who they note take for whatever that circumstance was. And in a lot of cases, the advice that we would give in that situation would be, I mean, you can identify friendly adults, but in general, when we think about the 504 or when we think about accommodations, we're generally not requiring something of other students. So unless there's something very specific, it wasn't really happening before that accommodations were requiring things of other students. And I think that's been one of the barriers around masking.
Cool. We have time for one more question. Yeah, go ahead, Mel.
Just a follow-up to that is, I think and you may not have an answer to this, and there may not be one answer to this, but what's so complicated is that when we're really talking about an airborne threat that is the barrier to access free and appropriate public education, there's no way to not impact other people. That is the barrier. It's their aerosols that are the barrier. So it's so hard. And what I've seen a lot of, even when we have, successfully advocated for various requests to be accepted, a lot of times what people ask, what school teams ask is they say, well, how will your recommendations change when, as the levels change in the community? And I say, well, we can talk about that when there's reliable data on community spread of COVID in the community. Because right now, the state closed the testing sites, and most people are doing rapid testing at home, and they're too busy having COVID to repeat their home tests. So I don't, and Cammie, I've heard you say, like, the law is one tool, but I wonder, like, do you have any perspectives on that aspect of it? Because it just seems like it's the science that's missing in these conversations. So it's like, well, why can't one, like you said before, why is one-way masking insufficient? Because it is. It's because the person with the COVID has to be wearing the mask in order to prevent transmission of the COVID. And when we don't test, and there's literally nothing else to do other than mask and ventilate.
Yeah, I hear that. So I do think that there's a lot of that I really can't speak to. That is why we need incredible powerhouse physicians who are educating and informing the community, because we're, you guys are the ones who know it, right? Physicians and scientists, and that's why we need the research. That's number one. We need research, we need education. The other thing that I think was really important about what you said was, well, will your recommendations change when the level of community spread changes? And that reminds me that it is really important when you are making your request to be thinking about making it time-based. And that doesn't mean the request expires, but a more successful request for masking is gonna have some of those things that I've stated earlier, right? Particular classroom or cohort in the area where people are moving about. And then the other one that I didn't mention earlier, and so thank you for the reminder, is time-based. So how long is this going to go before we have this discussion again, before we reevaluate? So in the cases that, the handful of cases that I've seen, masking is happening in certain environments until January, at which time it will be revisited. The conversation will be had again. That doesn't mean that anything has changed and that the accommodation is not still appropriate, but it is important to make sure that we're putting a sort of time limit on it to revisit the conversation. That does two things: makes it more likely that the district's not going to say it's a fundamental alteration, and ensures that the team's checking in again. Maybe we have better research. Maybe we know something more in a couple months. So thank you for that reminder.
Well, thanks so much, Cammie. If folks want to send some appreciations to Cammie in the chat, and then Cammie, could you super briefly just say, in what case would it make sense to get in touch with legal aid and how people can do that, since that's kind of the hat you're wearing. So thank you so much, Cammie. Appreciate all this information.
Yes, again, just to say, any of the information that I've discussed today is for informational purposes only. It's not individual legal advice. If you have a question related to specifically what your child might be entitled to, you know, that might be a good opportunity to reach out to us. In the fact sheet, Alyssa has included our contact information. So if you have questions about figuring out a successful accommodation for your individual child, you try to navigate the processes and it's just really difficult, and you want some advice to try to see what else. One of the things that we have frequently said to parents who we've consulted with in these situations is, based on your medical evidence, I don't think it's strong enough yet. And so if you've been told no and you don't understand why, or you need some support around why the district made the decision it did, you know, understanding their notice or their letter back to you, that might be a good time to call us. COVID related educational issues are one of our priorities right now. So we're definitely paying attention to those cases. So if you've reached some sort of barrier, you're not understanding your rights, you're not understanding your child's rights, that's when you should reach out to us. I will say our intake is taking somewhere between 7 and 14 days right now. So just be mindful of that. We're often not able to get back to you immediately. You know, and then if you've had that no and you are feeling really confident, you can also just always go directly to one of the entities that you can complain to.
Cool, thanks so much. And Eve, I see your hand up. I have a couple wrap up things to do, and then I know I'm able to stay on at 7 for a bit, and so we can definitely stay on for some informal conversation around 7 o'clock. But I'm going to wrap these things up first and bring it back to gallery. So I'm going to share my screen. We have a parent who has generously and anonymously shared some tips with us. And I would love, since I've been doing a lot of talking and I'm not a parent, if there was a parent that was open to reading these tips. We have 2 pages. So if there's a parent volunteer that wants to jump in and read these tips, that would be amazing. Anyone excited to do that? Or Eve, since you're on mic, do you want to go for it?
Okay, I'll try, but I have lecture for like 2 hours today, so I'm
I feel a little tired.
But okay.
Thank you.
You are the student's best advocate. In advance of the meeting, think through what the best case scenario would be and have to be your goal. Sorry, I realize I need my glasses. Sharing stories and experiences along with evidence and data are more persuasive than evidence and data alone. Don't be afraid of making sure the team knows what the impact of COVID could look like on your student's life, and learning based on past example. Self-advocacy will be a needed life skill for your student, and they will learn that from your advocacy efforts. So you learn from your advocacy efforts. So even when it feels really hard, it's making a positive difference. You're working against cultural norms, systems, and politics. People may have strong reaction, but don't take it personally.
Cool, thank you so much. And we have 3 more tips. If someone else is open to unmiking, who's a parent on here, to share these out, that would be awesome.
I continue.
Okay, thanks. You're doing great.
Take heart that the accommodations you secure for your student can provide universal design to safe access for those who don't have easy legal pathways for such access, such as high-risk staff and students needing to protect immunocompromised family members. Your advocacy promotes equity more broadly. The path from no accommodation to masking may be a zigzag instead of a direct path. If all you can secure at first is home or one-on-one instruction, take that to get your child immediate access to safety, and then keep fighting. Let the team know that it's not FAP, what is it? FAP?
Like I think it's fair. What's free access
Free
to
and appropriate public education in the
Okay.
least restrictive environment.
Thank you.
Okay, and continue taking the next step. For example, filing with OCR, an administrative complaint, or mediation. Have hope. The path to securing a accommodation may be a long and winding one, but federal civil rights law is on your side.
Thanks so much. And thanks to the parent who shared these. I'm not going to read over the whole fact sheet, but I'll just pull this up. I mentioned in the chat as we were talking, a lot of the stuff that Cammie mentioned is also in the fact sheet. So if you're wondering what the rights of your student are, if you want to know how to advocate at the school level, how to get a doctor's note, we also have some examples and lists of accommodations that you could add here. And at the end, we have a list of steps you can take if you believe your child rights are being violated. And thanks so much for Cammie and a couple of really amazing volunteers for helping put this document together. And we'll email that out at the end as well. And I wanted to show people really briefly how to submit to OCR. If you just go to the OCR website, it's a little complicated. You follow my own instructions here. You have to go to complaint form. And then you have to scroll down, say continue to electronic complaint form, and then begin assessment. I also included a link here, which actually makes things easier, which will take you directly to the assessment. So you'll have access to that as well. I'll send out this PowerPoint. Feel free to share that fact sheet. That's a public document. We want it to be used as an educational tool. And then in closing, we really want to encourage folks that are struggling. Again, as Cammie said, this isn't just like you need something, but you've already tried the processes in the school and they're not working for you, to submit to OCR, because this can help build a case and make bigger systemic changes. And then also anyone that maybe you're just an ally and your kid isn't the one struggling, know that you have a role to play in supporting parents or educators who are dealing with this issue personally. And I added my email here and I'll also put that in the chat. Feel free to reach out. I am definitely not a legal expert, but I'm happy to share any wisdom that I've gained from talking to parents and potentially able to connect you with people. So I can definitely be a resource. So I'm going to probably pause the recording now, and we'll just have some informal time to share. People are welcome to stay on. People need to leave, that's fine. I'll probably be here for about another 15 minutes or so. But really appreciate everyone coming out. Again, thank you to Cammie and to the parents that helped plan this. And thank you to you all for showing up. We hope it was useful. Let me stop the share here. Oops. I'm trying to end my video. Come on, Zoom. There we go. Stop share. And then